Hello, my name is Todd Baginski. I'm an 11-time SharePoint MVP and a partner and CTO at my company Canvas. In this training module, I'm going to show you how to work with different JavaScript frameworks and libraries. This is section 2 of the Working with Different JavaScript Frameworks and Libraries training module. In this section, I will discuss working with the Angular 1 framework. In this section, we're going to discuss implementing the Angular data services and controller. You'll need to create an Angular web part, how to define the Angular main module, and then how to register the Angular application with the web part. I'd like to start off by letting you know that all of the code that you're seeing in this module is part of the lab manual exercise associated with this training module. So all of the code that we're seeing here builds up to what we also see in the demo at the end of this module. The first thing you're going to do to implement your Angular web part with SharePoint Framework is to implement the Angular web parts data service. The sample apps Angular data service creates two different interfaces and one implementation. There's an interface representing a list item in your application. If you've seen these other training modules so far, you're familiar with why we create an interface to represent the list items that come back in our application. If you haven't seen that before, I encourage you to look at the earlier training modules where we talk about that in depth. There's also an interface to the data service that defines the different public methods used for creating, reading, updating, and deleting list items, or CRUD operations as we like to call them for short. And here you can see what these look like in the iData service interface. Then we have a class that implements the public methods of the data service interface, as well as private methods internally used by those CRUD methods. And those allow us to do all of the data operations we need with the SharePoint list data. When you're working with list data, you are going to need to return the current digest value for create, update, and delete operations that you do on SharePoint list items. To return that digest value, we recommend that you create a method specifically designed to obtain the digest. Here you can see an example of such a method. And you can reuse this method and call it over and over whenever you have those create, update, and delete operations taking effect in your web part. The other thing that you're going to need in more than one different type of CRUD operation, specifically for create and update operations on list items, is the specific item type for that list item entity, and you'll need to put that into the request body when you do create and update list item operations. To get a list item entity type, you get the property for the list, then you parse the list item entity type full name value, and that will give you the list item entity type. So here you can see a helper method that we created that's used to return the list item entity type. Reading list items is pretty straightforward. You use the SharePoint Context HTTP client to call SharePoint REST APIs. Here you can see an example of that being done. Now, when you create list items or when you update list items, you're going to follow this exact same pattern. You're going to get the list item entity type, which we talked about 2 slides back. You're going to get the digest value, which we talked about 3 slides back. Then you're going to set the list item entity type to the @odata.type in the request body. You can see that here on the right. Then you'll add the digest that you retrieved to the x-request digest header. You can also see this where this is done on the right in the code here. Then you'll use the SharePoint context HTTP client to call the SharePoint REST API to create a new list item. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the process for updating list items is exactly the same. So we have all the same steps here, and except we are just calling a little bit different code in the headers when we make our request to the SharePoint REST API to facilitate updating the item versus creating it. Deleting list items is a little bit different. Here you'll need to return the digest value, add the digest to the x-request digest header, and then use the SharePoint context HTTP client to call the SharePoint REST API. After you've created those different methods that you're going to need in your Angular web part to interact with SharePoint data, then you're going to want to implement the Angular controllers. The controller is going to control the communication between the views and the data service that you created. So to implement the controller, you'll follow these steps. You first import the interfaces defined in the data service. Then you'll define public properties that will be bound to your view and the internal private properties as well. Then you'll inject the data service into the controller using Angular's dependency injection capability. And then finally, you'll implement the methods that are exposed to the view. So things like the CRUD methods that call the corresponding CRUD methods in the data service. The constructor in the Angular app is going to subscribe an Angular event named init, like this. Then it's going to handle it by calling a private method named init, just like that. Then finally, that in turn is going to call into another private method to load the list items. If you're familiar with Angular, this should make a lot of sense to you. If you're not, it makes good sense to go back and learn Angular and how you create controllers and views and bind them together in Angular applications. Then there's several methods that are also exposed to the view. So here's the methods for showing the add new list item UI, updating a list item, adding a new list item, and deleting a list item. After you've created your controllers and worked with your views, the next thing you need to do is define the Angular main module. The Angular main module registers the data service and the controller inside of it. And here's what that code looks like. After you do that, then you register the Angular application with the web part itself. So to do that, you import the Angular main module, you define the Angular injector, then you define the template of the Angular view that's bound to the Angular controller, and finally you broadcast an Angular event named init when the web part is rendered. This is the web parts render method, or at least a subset of it. You can see some ... in the HTML code there where I trimmed out the larger part of the sample to make this more legible. But in the web parts render method, you'll define the template for the Angular view and you'll broadcast an Angular event named init. The template of the Angular view is then bound to the controller of the Angular application. To implement the web part CSS styles, you'll define those CSS styles in the whatever the web part name is .module.scss file, just like we've done here. In this demo, I'm going to show you how to work with JavaScript framework of Angular 1.x, and we're going to build a web part that does CRUD operations on SharePoint list items. Before I dive into the code on this module, I'd like to show you this web part in action. So this web part is going to read, write, update, and delete list items from this list I have here called test that's inside of my SharePoint Office 365 tenancy. So I have a test list here. This is just based on the custom list template that you get out of the box, and I put 2 list items into it here. Here I have the Angular application, SharePoint Framework web part running. It's this one right here. And you can see it pulls back and shows me there are 2 items in that test list. So I can do various things like update them. So I'll just take the one out of my name there and update it. You can see it gives you indication that that succeeded. I'll add a new item here. And I'll add another one that I'll delete here in just a second. So we can see we now have 4 list items in the list, and we can come back and go to the list, and for sure, there we are. And the one was taken off the list item with my name on it. So we saw that the update and the create operations, as well as the read operations, work real good. So let's go check out the delete operation here. Delete that item. That is successful. Come back to the page and verify it. So there we go. So this is basically what we're going to build here, and I'm going to walk you through how the code works to build such a web part that interacts with SharePoint list items that's built on the Angular framework. So the first place I like to start is just showing you the web part itself is located under Module 7, Demos, Exercise 1. So that's the one we're working with right now. So as I open up this web part here, a place I would like to start is this app folder we created. This is where we're going to define the app's module, the data service, as well as the controller that implements this Angular application. So let's start out with the data service. As I mentioned in the slide deck, we're going to import Angular. We're going to create an interface that represents our list items. Then we're going to create another interface here for this data service that exposes the public methods inside of it for getting, adding, updating, and deleting list items. Then we create the actual data service class itself. You can see it implements that interface we just created at the top of this. And then we have our various methods for getting, adding, updating, and deleting list items. That takes care of making your data service. As I mentioned, depending on the operation you're doing, you may need to do things like return the request digest and then use that request digest as you pass it into the headers like that. So that's needed on the add list item there, for example. You can also see it's used on the update list item here as well. Remember, the other thing that we talked about that you have to do with some of these operations is you have to set the list item entity type's full name to the @OData type right there in the body when you do certain operations. And so the update list item here is a good example of where that needs to be done. After you have created your data service file, the next thing you need to do is move on and create your controller. So here is the controller that we have created. We're importing those 2 interfaces from our data service as well as Angular here. We are registering our public properties as well as the private properties that we need inside of this controller. Then in our constructor, we follow that pattern that I talked about before of setting the root scope and the window and the data service and everything we need inside of this controller for Angular. And here's where we register our init event. After we've got that done, next thing we do is we implement all of the different controller methods that will allow us to do things and invoke things in our data service or in our user interface. So here's the show add new, which shows our new item dialog. We also have the operations here for adding new list items, updating them, deleting them, and then finally the init method that I talked about before that is going to be fired the first time this controller is invoked. After you square that away, then what you need to do is create the main module for the Angular application and register the data service and controller with it. So here's my main module. You can see it's very simple code here. Import my controller, Angular, and the data service. And then in the Angular app that we create, register our controller and our data service. At that point, we are ready to actually go and register the Angular application with the web part itself. To do so, I'll go to the Hello World Angular 1 web part base class here, and notice these two import statements right here. Very important. This code loads a reference to the Angular and the Angular application created in the steps that I showed you previously. Both of these items are necessary to bootstrap the Angular application properly. The next thing that I'm doing in the beginning of my class here is creating my injector and list name variables. The injector code gives me the ability to broadcast events to the Angular application, and the list name is just the name of the SharePoint list that we're going to do the CRUD operations with. After I've done that, then I can turn my attention to the render method. Here you can see I built up my render method right here, and it extends down a little further. The first thing the code is going to do is assign the template associated with the Angular application directly to the web parts DOM element. Notice the name of the controller that will handle events and the data binding in the template is set here on my root element. If we look at the bottom of the render method, you can see that the application is bootstrapped using the Angular app name right here, previously used when the main module was declared. If we go back up to the top, it's important to notice this if statement. This rendered once web part property ensures that the Angular application is bootstrapped only once. Without it, if one of the web part's properties change, for instance, the render method would be invoked again, bootstrapping the Angular application for a second or maybe even more times, and that would lead to errors. So that's why we do that important check right there. At the end of the render method, we add this code to initialize the Angular application. This code broadcasts an init event to the Angular app, and the Angular application initializes itself after it receives the event. So there you have it. Those are the different pieces of the puzzle that it takes to create a SharePoint Framework web part built on the Angular 1.x platform, and that allows you to build a web part such like this that allows you to do simple create, read, update, and delete operations on SharePoint list data. In summary, in this section, we learned how to implement the Angular data services and controllers, how to define the Angular main module, and how to register the Angular application with the web part. You can learn more about SharePoint Framework and all the things we've talked about here in the SharePoint Patterns and Practices. You can get to this via the URL aka.ms/SharePointPNP. There's a ton of code samples and solutions, reusable components, a lot of guidance documentation, and also monthly community calls that you can watch here to learn all about the SharePoint Framework, SharePoint add-ins, Microsoft Graph, and Office 365 APIs.